Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Urban Adaptation, Resilience, and Managed Retreat. We have some great presenters and panelists today, and I will introduce them in just a minute. First, just a little bit of housekeeping. All attendees are on mute, so we would love to hear from you, but we can only hear from you if you submit your questions through the GoToWebinar control panel on the question box. The session is being recorded. We'll share a link within the next few days. And then I also want to tell you just a little bit about the Salazar Center. I think I forgot to introduce myself. So I am Dominique Gomez, and I am the program director at the Salazar Center at Colorado State University. And at the Salazar Center, we work on advancing the health and connectivity of natural systems and landscapes across North America. And we know that healthy natural systems support climate adaptation and resilience, protect biodiversity, and support long-term human health. And we take an intersectional approach to build bridges to connect academic research, community practice, and policy. And we really invite you to learn more about us by following us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, Facebook, and by looking at our website salazarcenter.colorado.edu. And among other things, we do run this great webinar series, which is Connecting for Conservation. We explore all sorts of different topics in modern day environmental issues, environmental justice, climate change. We've talked about urban forestry, we've talked about cross-border issues, and today I am very excited to have a very important topic and something that I know many of you really want to learn more about, which is managed retreat. As our communities, both coastal and inland, think about how they manage climate change. We know that we've talked about green infrastructure, we've talked about natural spaces, we've talked about all the different ways communities will become more resilient. But I think it's also important to think about planning for resilience, and managed retreat is one way to do that. And so today we have three wonderful panelists who will talk a little bit about their work. We'll start at a more national level and then go to the local level. And then we will have time for some question and answer. And we actually have two additional people joining us today for that part, so I'll introduce them as we go. Very excited to talk about managed retreat today, and we'll get to as many questions. So go ahead and submit those through the GoToWebinar control panel as we go. With that, I want to introduce our first wonderful panelist, Micah McMillan. He is the senior analyst in the Natural Resources Environment team of the GAO, where he has worked since 2004. Micah's work has primarily focused on climate change, water, infrastructure, and the impacts of energy production on water quality. Micah has a master's degree in environmental science and public affairs from the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. And with that, Micah, I will be sharing the, here we go. Micah, can you hear us?
Yeah, sure can. Is everything showing up properly for the presentation?
Just 1 minute here. There we go. I don't think we can see it just yet. Let me try this again here. So,
Dominique, do you want to just run it from your screen? Would that be easier?
Yeah, let's try. You want to try and share one more time?
Yeah, let me share. Let me get one more shot. Okay, are you seeing it now?
Perfect. Looks great. Thanks, Micah.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, no worries. Thank you. I just want to say thanks again to Dominique and everyone else at Salazar Center for giving us a chance to present our work. I'm just going to start off by giving a little background on GAO and sort of our work on climate change to kind of frame the issue. But for those of you that don't know, GAO is an independent, nonpartisan agency that works for Congress and investigates how the federal government spends taxpayer dollars. Our work is primarily done at the request of congressional committees, but it can also be mandated in laws or sometimes committee reports. And we provide Congress and the public with information that they can use to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of government and also to save taxpayer dollars. And our climate change work is because it's cross-cutting. We do it in a number of our different teams, but it's primarily managed out of our natural resources and environment team. Okay, so sorry, get a little bit of a lag there. Every 2 years, GAO issues the high risk list, which is a list of programs and operations that are high risk due to their vulnerabilities from fraud, waste and abuse, mismanagement, or just issues that need transformation in general. In 2013, we placed climate change on our high risk list, which sort of elevated its importance for us as well as the rest of the federal government. And it was primarily due to the fiscal exposure due to the impacts of climate change to the federal government. Within that work, we've sort of identified 5 key areas of risk. One is the federal insurance programs. Second is disaster aid and resilience. The third is technical assistance to public and private sector decision makers. And the fourth is the federal role as leader of the National Climate Strategic Plan. And the final one is federal ownership of property. And our next update is going to be due in February 2021. Okay. All right. GAO has issued 10 reports on climate change over the past year and has 12 more underway across the different mission teams. The topics include infrastructure, natural disasters, economic costs and opportunities, agriculture, climate migration, tribal issues, nuclear waste, and Superfund sites. We have some related work ongoing on federal flood insurance programs, as well as the economic costs of hurricanes that is related. Okay, and our work in this area primarily has found recommendations in a couple of two key categories, mainstreaming by integrating climate change preparedness and resilience in all federal activities, and creating new institutions to address large-scale projects that cut across agency missions and pose fiscal exposures that one agency is not capable of managing. And this is kind of consistent with what the fourth climate assessment has found, which is mainstreaming alone is not sufficient to address our most significant climate risks. And larger cross-cutting projects, such as climate migration, will need additional federal investment. And our work on climate migration kind of falls more into the new institutions area. And then another thing that we issued recently that we think people should be familiar with is our disaster resilience framework. And we issued that in the fall of 2019, and it sort of identifies principles that can be applied to any federal disaster resilience effort to help federal agencies and policymakers promote and facilitate disaster risk reduction. It focuses on 3 key areas. The first is access to information on the risks and risk reduction strategies. It is authoritative and understandable. The second one is integrated analysis and planning to help take coordinated resilience actions. And the third is incentives to help make forward-looking risk reduction investments more viable and attractive among competing priorities. So our climate migration work, the most recent national climate assessment said relocation due to climate change will be unavoidable in some coastal areas, and climate migration or the preemptive movement of people and property away from those areas or other areas with experiencing severe impacts is one way to improve climate resilience. We conducted a review of relevant literature to identify case studies and experts, and we also interviewed key federal agencies, including NOAA, HUD, FEMA, USGCRP, and the Denali Commission. Overall, we found that there are just a few communities nationwide that have actively considered climate migration as a resilience strategy. And from those communities that we identified, we selected Santa Rosa, Ile de Jean Charles, Smith Island, and Newtok, Alaska, for the communities that we were going to conduct case studies on. Only Ile de Jean Charles and Newtok have decided to move forward with relocation because their climate threats are imminent or existential. For example, Ile de Jean Charles has lost 98% of its land mass since the 1950s due to sea level rise, storm surge, and unsustainable oil and gas production practices, among other factors. And the Denali Commission projects that Newtok will be uninhabitable within the next few years due to thawing permafrost and coastal erosion. Overall, we found that federal programs provide limited support to climate migration efforts because they are generally designed to address other priorities. And because no federal agency really has the authority to lead federal assistance for climate migration, support for climate migration efforts has been provided on an ad hoc basis. And as a result, they don't really have the scope, scale, or level of continuity necessary to assist communities with migration. In part because no federal entity has the authority to coordinate federal financial and technical assistance necessary to carry out migration. It's taken over 30 years to begin relocating Newtok and more than 20 years to start the same process in Ile-de-Jean Charles. In 2016, the federal government, sort of recognizing this, created an interagency working group on managed retreat and relocation to help determine what the federal role should be in assisting these communities, but it was disbanded in early 2017. Okay. And overall, little is known about how federal programs should be changed or if new programs should be created to assist communities with migration. But based on our work, we found that project management best practices and recommendations from the National Mitigation Investment Strategy support the idea that pilot programs can be an effective tool to test new policies and assess lessons learned before scaling them up to the national level. And based on that, we recommended that Congress should consider establishing a pilot program with clear federal leadership to identify and provide assistance to communities that express affirmative interest in relocation as a resilient strategy. And sort of from our ongoing work, we've identified several factors that we think should be considered in the creation of this pilot program. The first is sort of promoting community-led planning, mostly because socioeconomic and cultural political connections to a geographic region may be strong, and it makes it difficult to consider as a resilient strategy. And there's some evidence that community-led groups that facilitate strategic planning can expedite the progress and build public support for climate migration. Also, it should address limited community capacity and access to funding. And, I think this is a problem across all federal programs, but it's a more problem, particularly in this area. Moving an entire community requires a significant amount of technical expertise that many local communities don't have. And overall costs of these communities can be prohibitive as well. And communities will need to pull federal, state, and local funding from different programs with differing requirements and selection criteria. Newtok's relocation effort, for example, has already cost about $64 million, and it's projected to cost an additional $150 million. All right, the third is promote coordination across all relevant levels of government. And, funding decisions are often made at the federal and state level based on sometimes differing priorities, while zoning and planning decisions are made at the local level. Whether a community decides to remain in place or relocate, there needs to be coordination and agreement across all levels of government. And finally, it's really important that they emphasize public service delivery and receiving and migrating communities. We found that loss of revenue can impact the community's ability to provide those basic services as it gradually migrates, and receiving communities may not have the capacity to provide the services to the migrating population. This has been of particular concern in more rural areas such as Newtok or Ile-de-Jean Charles. And as they relocate, then communities will need to make sure that they can provide basic services in both the receiving and migrating communities. So I think that's it for me, and I look forward to your questions after everybody else has had the opportunity to present.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Micah. That was wonderful to start with the GAO, and your report really is what got this whole webinar going. So I really appreciate that, and I know we're going to have quite a few questions for you. With that, I want to introduce our next presenter. Katie Spidalieri is the Senior Associate at the Georgetown Climate Center, and she provides legal and policy analysis on adaptation projects at the federal, state, and local levels. Her work focuses on adaptation in the coastal sector, including evaluating land use and other tools and strategies such as managed retreat to adapt to rising seas and flooding. Katie graduated with a JD from the Cleveland Marshall College of Law and the University of Virginia, where she received 2 degrees in history and an interdisciplinary environmental thought and practice program. And Katie is currently pursuing her Master's of Law in Environmental and Energy Law at Georgetown University Law Center. Katie, thank you so much for joining us. So excited to have you present as well.
Thank you, Dominique and the Salazar Center for hosting us in this important discussion today. Dominique, is everything good with my sound, and can you see my slides?
Yes, both perfectly, thank you.
Wonderful. For those of you who don't know, Georgetown Climate Center is a nonprofit that's affiliated with Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. We serve as a climate law and policy resource for states and communities that are tackling questions both of climate mitigation, so reducing emissions from both the power and transportation sectors, and also adaptation to help states and communities prepare for the impacts they're facing from climate change. Today, I'm here to present one of our newest online resources. Rising seas and increasingly frequent and intense extreme weather events are leading many coastal communities to confront difficult questions about how best to protect people, development, infrastructure, and coastal ecosystems from climate change impacts. The voluntary movement and transition of communities and ecosystems away from vulnerable coastal areas is increasingly being considered as a strategy for climate adaptation. In the face of unchecked climate change, the alternative in many places is unfortunately unmanaged retreat, and the consequences can be devastating. GCC's new Managed Retreat Toolkit is the first comprehensive online resource on managed retreat. The toolkit combines legal and policy tools, best and emerging practices, and case studies to support peer learning and decision-making around managed retreat and climate adaptation. With the toolkit, we recognize that managed retreat will not always be the best or preferred strategy in a community, but we are aiming to fill an informational gap to bring support for more interdisciplinary and nuanced discussions around managed retreat, acknowledging that it is only one part of the coastal adaptation solution set, also with protection strategies like hard armoring and levees, and also accommodation strategies through elevations and flood proofing, all 3 of which will play a role. Under the best of circumstances, we use the definition in the Managed Retreat Toolkit that managed retreat is the coordinated process of voluntarily and equitably relocating people, structures, and infrastructure away from vulnerable coastal areas, and also facilitating transitions for people, communities, and ecosystems to higher ground or further inland. In practice, however, managed retreat is an inherently complex and challenging subject for state and local governments. Everything in this toolkit is intended to make it easier for decision makers and the communities they serve to have those hard conversations and plan together for the benefit of all. The primary audiences for this toolkit are state, territorial, and local policymakers in U.S. coastal jurisdictions. But the toolkit could also benefit non-coastal communities dealing with other types of flooding, or those that are going to serve as receiving communities, as Micah talked a little bit about, and we'll explore more in today's presentation and discussion. Overall, the toolkit contains 8 total sections that present different legal and policy tools state and local coastal governments can evaluate to potentially implement broader managed retreat strategies. Section 1 is an introduction that tells you how the toolkit can be used and how it's organized. The introduction also includes an acknowledgement section that lists the literally dozens of policymakers, experts, and community stakeholders who inform this effort. In short, the toolkit is a practical effort that was informed by practitioners and is for practitioners on the ground. So it's intended to be useful, and we look forward to hearing feedback from practitioners, policymakers, and community stakeholders who put it into practice so we can continue to refine it and make it a living resource going forward. The other 7 sections of the toolkit fall into 2 categories. The toolkit contains 5 what we call tools sections that identify the legal approaches that jurisdictions can consider adapting to meet local context and needs around managed retreat. These include planning, infrastructure, acquisition, regulatory, and market-based tools. State and local decision makers can apply each tool individually or think about advancing a potential suite of tools collectively as a part of more comprehensive managed retreat strategies. The toolkit also contains 2 cross-cutting sections on legal and policy considerations, respectively. These sections present a deeper dive look into legal and policy questions and issues that are raised across all or most tools. For example, one notable cross-cutting legal question is how can governments minimize the potential legal risk associated with regulatory takings of private property under both the 5th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and state analogs. Similarly, cross-cutting policy issues explored in the toolkit include how to fund managed retreat strategies, facilitate wetland migration inland, engage communities, and plan for and make investments in receiving people in different areas where people may choose to relocate away from the coast. We don't have time to cover everything in the toolkit today, so I wanted to present 5 key takeaways that cut across all the individual tools included in the toolkit. During the discussion portion, I'm happy to answer questions about anything I'm discussing now or something else that sort of piqued your interest based on this overview of the toolkit. First, by definition, managed retreat starts with planning, and that takes time. That's the quote unquote managed part of retreat. We have designed this toolkit to help communities start the conversation now, before they are forced to leave their homes and communities. Second, managed retreat is complex and inherently interdisciplinary. Preparing to move out of harm's way requires legal and policy work, financial and fiscal strategy, and particularly inclusive, open engagement with people in the communities affected. It can also involve land use planning, infrastructure realignment or disinvestment, natural resources science, and an understanding of the implications for both affected coastal communities and higher ground or inland receiving communities. This will require that policymakers, non-governmental partners, and community stakeholders across different agencies, levels of government, and areas of expertise work together from the outset to better navigate the complexities of managed retreat to maximize the various benefits and minimize the various costs associated with these types of decisions. The Managed Retreat Toolkit is designed with in-depth sections on each of the key aspects of a comprehensive managed retreat strategy. And we also really made an effort to cross-link different sections to point out the relationships among the different tools and policy considerations. Third, successful development and implementation of managed retreat strategies must be inclusive. Unless the people who live in the communities affected are authentically, openly, and meaningfully included in the decision-making process from the start, there's little hope of achieving outcomes that are fair and successful. The decision of whether or not to retreat must start with and be led by affected communities. And any potential strategies and community engagement and planning processes need to be adapted to build trust in coastal communities where it doesn't already exist, and also importantly address the historical and racial inequities where they exist, so that way policymakers can create and implement truly equitable processes. Fourth, hazard mitigation buyouts are the tool most synonymous with the term managed retreat and are often discussed as really the only or pioneering option for states and local communities considering managed retreat. While buyouts are an important tool and will continue to be used, possibly at larger scales as Micah discussed, they are not the only tool in the toolkit, or the toolbox as some might say. Policymakers and communities should be aware of the range of options they have to implement managed retreat strategies to develop decisions that best meet local context and needs. Moreover, climate adaptation and resilience does not always have to be about quote unquote reinventing the wheel. So for example, several of the planning and regulatory tools that we discuss in the toolkit are tools that local governments can consider using now, and they're already longstanding tools that they already possess. So local governments can use their local comprehensive plans, which are sometimes also called general or master plans, and their land use and zoning powers to discourage development in vulnerable coastal zones and increase density in higher ground, safer areas. Finally, comprehensive managed retreat strategies must be about more than just helping people walk away from vulnerable coastal areas. Policymakers also have to put laws and policies in place to help people transition to safer areas and minimize the social, psychological, and economic costs of relocating. Notably, governments can seek to plan to become receiving communities and make proactive investments in affordable housing, infrastructure, and critical services like schools, while avoiding displacement and gentrification in those receiving areas. Policymakers must also think comprehensively about what's really being left behind if people choose to retreat away from the coast. People remaining in coastal communities will benefit from restored and conserved coastal environments to mitigate flood risks. Open space can also be converted to serve as important parks and also recreational community assets. It's important to remember and elevate the conservation and protection of coastal habitats like wetlands and natural resources like bird species to maximize ecosystem and other benefits. We arrived at these and other takeaways by engaging with and learning from federal, state, and local policymakers and other experts and community stakeholders. All this information is captured in the Managed Retreat Toolkit and also 70 independent case studies to support peer learning and discussion about this challenging but important topic. We present 17 of these case studies in greater depth to share the many takeaways and lesson learns from comprehensive strategies and examples of where managed retreat is occurring on the ground. One of these case studies features the ongoing work in the neighborhood of Edgemere in Queens that our next speaker will talk about. I just wanted to thank you for your time, and again to the Salazar Center for hosting us. I encourage you to check out the Managed Retreat online at the link you see on your screen, and also to reach out to me after today's presentation if you have any questions or feedback. But I also look forward to the discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was great. And I am so excited for the discussion because I know you have just a wealth of knowledge from all of these different case studies and from building your toolkit. I'm so excited to get to the discussion after our next presenter. We've gotten some great questions, but again, feel free to submit your questions throughout and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. With that, I want to introduce Lauren Wang. Lauren is a senior policy advisor and urban planner leading land use initiatives at the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency. Previously, she served as Director of Resiliency Planning and Acquisitions at the NYC Department of Housing Preservation and Development, and she has collaborated with partners in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors to deliver Hurricane Sandy recovery services to homeowners and tenants across New York City and to transform storm-damaged homes into new resilient uses. She holds a master's in city and regional planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a bachelor's of art from Princeton University. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us and very excited to hear you share a little bit about your work in New York.
Thank you, Dominique. Let's see if I can successfully share my screen. I think you might want to tap into my other account that's signed in. Great, thank you. Interesting. Trying to get to screen. Okay, thank you so much for bearing with me.
Looks good.
There we go. Thank you. So yes, very delighted to represent the local perspective here from New York City, a small town of 8.5 million people over on the Eastern Seaboard. I'm here representing the Mayor's Office of Resiliency, which strives to adapt New York City to the unprecedented challenge of climate change, and I'm also partnered with my colleague Lida Aljabar from the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, which I'll call HPD for short because that's a mouthful. HPD is the largest affordable housing agency in the nation and preserves the housing and neighborhoods of New York City and supports their quality of life. I'm going to start with a bird's eye view of New York City that has a couple of familiar landmarks, I hope, Central Park and Brooklyn Bridge and the island of Manhattan. Today we'll be focused on the neighborhood of Edgemere, Queens, which is due south of JFK Airport over on the east side of our city. This image is striking because it shows our 520 miles of coastline, which is more miles than several other major cities combined. And for us, the challenge of climate change, particularly increased flooding risk, is one that we take very seriously. In 2012, we had a major hurricane, superstorm, or Hurricane Sandy wash across many of our coastal neighborhoods, and that was really a wake-up call to take climate change seriously and to consider its impacts in the near term through recovery and also decades into the future. One other point also I want to highlight before moving on from this slide is that, working in New York City, we're constantly traveling between scales. We have our 5 counties or 5 boroughs. We have neighborhoods, many of which are the size of a town anywhere else, and as well as our natural ecology of barrier islands and other coastal marsh and so on. And so all of our systems, our built environment, our human social networks, and our natural environment are deeply intertwined, and any adaptation approach, particularly one as expansive as today's topic, needs to consider those deep connections. We know that New York City is getting hotter and wetter, not only from events like Hurricane Sandy, but also slower moving climate stresses. These are individually events that might look like this few inches of water, this nuisance flooding on the ground in the neighborhood of Edgemere. While each event in and of itself may not be catastrophic, in some, cumulatively over time, these will lead to damage and disruption that really affects quality of life and ways that one gets around and thrives in a neighborhood. And so with that, our approach in New York City to climate adaptation is multi-layered and very much based in our diverse communities. As our director, Janie Bavishi, said recently, there's no silver bullet solution to the impacts of climate change. We recognize full well that our city is diverse, that no two neighborhoods are alike, and our approach really centers on 3 pillars of resiliency, which is 1, to consider physical resiliency to a phenomenon like flooding. Secondly, to consider financial resiliency, not only for the private homeowners, but also for the city in terms of how we weigh difficult trade-offs. And then finally, operational resiliency or day-to-day resiliency for residents, businesses, and city agencies operating critical infrastructure. We're going to travel back now to 2012 and a closer view of the Rockaway Peninsula. Here you see that the peninsula stretches from Edgemere further out west, closer to Staten Island and into the Atlantic Ocean. On the south, you have the ocean, and on the north, Jamaica Bay. An interesting feature that's not apparent on this aerial view is that the highest point of the peninsula is actually closer to the Atlantic Ocean side. And so for our Jamaica Bay communities, the bay side is actually the area of greater vulnerability. And this is true also for Edgemere, which sits on the bay side of the Rockaway Peninsula. During Hurricane Sandy, the beach met the bay, and what that meant is that every single home in Edgemere flooded. 2 years out from the storm in 2014, Edgemere still showed signs of physical and financial distress. Here are some images capturing the ponding that was a fairly regular and continues to be a fairly regular occurrence, vacant and underutilized property that came to the city through our in-rem foreclosure crisis 40 to 50 years ago, as well as the elevated A train, which is an asset, although in these far reaches, somewhat slow and unreliable, and desire paths through vacant lots to reach the subway station. Lastly, but arguably most importantly, the housing stock continued to show signs of physical and financial distress, both storm-damaged homes as well as homes that appeared to be abandoned. Because all of this, the Department of Housing Preservation and Development organized an effort to work with the community to create the Resilient Edgemere Community Plan. I want to start at the top of this vision, this long-term vision, and highlight that the open green space at the tip of the peninsula is the most vulnerable part of the neighborhood to coastal flooding and is a place where today 30 to 40 households do live. This is not the only feature of the plan. I want to stress that this plan is more than anything else a community development, community revitalization, and neighborhood plan that includes strengthening the resiliency of existing homes, as you see in the elevated homes in the middle of the image, as well as new development closer to the elevated subway track to bring much needed resources like retail and housing to the neighborhood and to the city. This vision was created through a 5-step process that was not unique to Edgemere, but was rather part of a citywide approach to neighborhood planning. This neighborhood planning approach shifted our own paradigm by starting, instead of with a predetermined outcome, with an open-ended dialogue with neighborhoods and community stakeholders. That lesson translates as well to dialogues about climate adaptation, we think, rather than starting with a predetermined outcome, to really listen. Start by listening. And so to support that, the city developed 4 workshops and implementation and an ongoing dialogue with the community very much continues today. I'm going to take us back to 2016 as part of the workshop process here to a workshop activity that was really the first time that New York City brought climate change to the forefront of a neighborhood planning conversation. What you see here on the maps are low, mid, and high estimates of sea level rise of daily tidal inundation in the neighborhood of Edgemere in 2050. We pulled these images together to express the uncertainty, but also to really simply pose the question, if you are here, in 30 years, will you still be living here? And if so, how can we prepare for the future together? What we heard spanned a spectrum. Some folks said, look, I've been living here for 30, 40 years. I'm used to it, and I'm going to live here for as long as I can because this is my community. Other folks we heard said things like, look, I've been trying to move. I've been trying to move for a couple of years. It's really hard to get to work. It's hard for my kid to get to school here. The transit is unreliable, and so the first chance I get, I'm going to leave this neighborhood. There were all sorts of different responses, and it was really, I think, a lesson learned for us in the value of just coming out with information and having that open-ended conversation. Conversations like this one, also focused on other neighborhood quality of life issues, led to a conceptual land use framework and several main strategies that HPD carries forward today. One on the vulnerable coastal edge to protect the community from coastal flooding. Secondly, through zoning and other tools to limit new development in the most vulnerable part of the neighborhood. Thirdly, to strengthen the resiliency of existing homes and filling gaps on vacant sites owned by the city. And then lastly, to strengthen the residential and retail hubs and corridors by bringing these services to a neighborhood that sorely needs them. This land use framework and strategies are being implemented through 65 different projects today, and we look forward to addressing questions in the Q&A. In parallel with the neighborhood planning process, I also want to highlight our city's housing recovery programs and a pilot that was specific to the neighborhood of Edgemere. All told, in Edgemere, 109 of the 1,700 households participated in the city's CDBG DR funded housing recovery program post-Sandy. Over the course of years, the program engaged in a sustained dialogue with homeowners and with tenants and really sought to adapt its services to facilitate housing stability and housing mobility for folks depending on their choice. What we show here is 2 images of homes that were elevated in Edgemere, and you can see that they're about 4 to 8 feet above grade, which is the design flood elevation in this neighborhood, and have other resilient features. Hard to see, but somewhere are some flood vents and raised raised utility meters. The other service that I'd like to highlight from Build It Back are services that facilitated housing mobility. What do I mean by housing mobility? If we ask ourselves what it is that buyout and acquisition programs really achieve at the end of the day, they offer a path for folks to move out of an area of hazard, right? So in Edgemere, of the folks that participated, a small number, 11 homeowners in Edgemere chose a buyout or acquisition pathway, or relocated, had a new resilient home built on a site within the neighborhood. Our neighborhood planning conversations also informed this process in that we heard most folks really loved their neighborhood and wanted to stay. For those that chose to leave, about 2/3 lived in the most vulnerable part of the neighborhood, the coastal A zone that's subject to hazardous waves, and received a pre-storm value for their home and could move with it wherever they liked. For those folks that really wanted to stay in the neighborhood and lived in the area of hazard, we also offered a relocation rebuild pilot, which is featured in Georgetown's Toolkit as under the land swap chapter. One unique feature of Edgemere as a neighborhood is that the city owns a number of vacant sites. And with that, we were able to offer a comparable site for the construction of a new elevated resilient home for 3 households who chose that option. This process was challenging because we were working with a rather incomplete toolkit. For example, one of the homes had a mortgage, which is a pretty standard form of debt. It's a standard debt instrument on a home. And in order to transfer that mortgage from the storm damaged property onto the new home, we had to get really creative, working with a local mission-driven nonprofit, the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, to devise a way to transfer that debt, as well as working with the bank, which was a major lender. As well, a couple of the homes, one had tenants and were afforded rental assistance under the Uniform Relocation Act. And all throughout, we relied heavily on our case managers and housing counselors to help translate and help coach our homeowners through a difficult difficult acquisition and buyout process. So with that, I want to end on some lessons learned. What are, in New York City, our lessons learned as we shift from storm recovery to long-term climate adaptation? One, this is true not only for climate adaptation, but also for neighborhood planning or community planning or comprehensive or master planning as a whole, which is that adaptation, this process of managing change must center residents that live in the affected area and center their quality of life. Secondly, listening to storm survivors and residents facing climate change is absolutely key. And this change must be voluntary, must be equitable top to bottom in process and product, and must be focused on household needs. Throughout, as we learn together, government, community partners, researchers, practitioners should seek to empower residents and communities to determine and shape their own future. I'll end on a note to say that Resilient Edgemere is very much a living document and a process of ongoing dialogue between the city and this community, between residents and each other, between the many partners that participate in implementing a plan that covers as many bases as this one does. What we've realized is that, rather than managing retreat, we are really at the start of managing a new kind of change in our city. And through that process, the deep connections between, again, our environmental, our natural systems, our built environment, and our human-based systems are inescapable. We see a lot of opportunity in that to learn together and to build towards a more equitable and vibrant future. And with that, I'll close. And thanks again for the opportunity to share this work with this audience.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was a wonderful introduction to the work in New York, and I think really helps to make it real for people, just a little more specific example. With that, we are to the moderated discussion. I want to introduce two additional panelists who will be joining us today, and then we'll all get on webcam here and as we go here. So if you guys want to join us as we go. Lida Aljabar is an urban planner, researcher, and educator working at the intersection of urbanism, climate change, and social justice. She leads climate resilient neighborhood planning and design initiatives at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. And previously, she led the National Climate Smart Cities program at the Trust for Public Land, advancing green infrastructure for climate equity in cities across the nation. And she is a visiting assistant professor at Pratt Institute and a forefront fellow at the Urban Design Forum. So Lida, thank you for joining us. And lastly, also wanted to introduce Joe Thompson. He is an assistant director in GAO's Natural Resources and Environment team. He coordinates GAO's climate change and air pollution work and has been at GAO for over 18 years. He has degrees from the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability and a master's in public affairs from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And most of his free time is spent playing with his one-year-old daughter, Audra, and changing her diapers, because that's what we parents do. Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us all today. And I think that this is just such an important webinar for a few reasons. It struck me, Lauren, at the end, as you talked about the time and it took to build the plan and engage community. I think as the climate adaptation community and people working on climate change and conservation, it's going to take time for us to build out how to do this, right? That this is not something that everyone knows how to do or that we're doing perfectly anywhere. And so, I think Katie, your toolkit is so important, and Micah and Joe, your report of just stating the need to have a better strategy and think about the best ways to handle this reality. I think it's so important, and that's going to take time. And so I think having this conversation is really important. So to start, we have a lot of questions. We'll get to as many as we possibly can. But to start, I just want to start by saying a lot of people, managed retreat is not something that they've never necessarily heard before, right? Just even the term is something that might be not so familiar, not so comfortable. And so we'd love to start with you, Katie, and then hear from others as well. When you bring this up, how do you even frame it for someone who maybe is working on climate, aware of climate change, but hasn't thought about this, whether they're on the coast or whether they're inland? And Mike and Joe will certainly talk to you about some of your non-coastal case studies.
Thanks, Dominique, and for people submitting the questions. For me, my starting point is always thinking about, I think as the Resilient Edgemere example shows, there's a spectrum of different adaptation responses people can take in the coastal environment or elsewhere. So you have more traditional protection measures, which are usually thought of as like seawalls or levees, which basically allow people to stay in place and keep the flood waters back. Or you have elevation, which is sort of second, thinking about living with the water, where you elevate homes or you will flood-proof them so people can stay in place, but in some ways their structures are acknowledging the risk and ability to adapt to them. And then third, a retreat is the idea of thinking about people development, like private development, homes and businesses, infrastructure and ecosystems. And when a threat becomes too severe, potentially in a location, and communities make the decision to move away from that threat, that's the concept of retreat. So there's going to be different thresholds when people choose to pursue one option over another. But the idea is really thinking comprehensively about all of these options and bringing them to the table at the same time, so people have, as you were saying, the chance to consider all options at the same time and really plan for them upfront.
That makes sense. Lida and Lauren, when you are working in Edgemere and you're talking about buyouts as an option, how do you start that conversation? What does that look like?
That's an interesting question. So the unique thing about this Resilient Edgemere and recovery process is that it was a long-term visioning plan that really started in parallel with a lot of storm recovery work and really significant storm recovery work. And so for us, the Resilient Edgemere plan and planning process was a way to tie that recovery into that more holistic long-term view of, what makes sense for the residents of Edgemere, what Edgemere residents really want. And so the conversation did not start with a buyout. It really started with from the planning side, what do you want from your community, and then from the housing recovery side in parallel, for you as a homeowner, especially as a homeowner, what makes sense for your family.
Makes sense. Lida, anything to add?
I think Lauren really, I'm hearing an echo. Can you all hear that?
We hear you okay.
Okay, great, just me. So yeah, I think Lauren really hit the main parts. I think the other kind of aspect that it really is ongoing here is about although some of the intensive engagement within this neighborhood started at a disaster recovery moment, a lot of that work really is ongoing. And so what we're in a phase of now is thinking, really taking that long-term view as we have these different investments really take shape and take form within the neighborhood, and folks' experience and preferences may evolve with that, as well at the same time that the community undergoes even more typical transitions and evolutions as a community. So really centering quality of life for the residents, be it they're choosing to stay in their community, or really being open to supporting their own mobility and choice is how we kind of approach it.
Makes a lot of sense. Micah and Joe, want to go to you on sort of a related question. So we talked a lot about coastal issues today, and obviously that is one of the big issues with climate changes, is knowing sea level rise will affect lots of communities and lots of population centers. But you also in your case studies look at Santa Rosa, which is not a coastal community. Can you talk a little bit about how they thought about managed retreat, given it's a very different context, and maybe just give a quick background on that community for people who aren't familiar.
You want that one, Micah?
Well, I mean, I think what happened, they started to think about it after the big California fires in 2017, which wiped out a significant portion of their community. And there was one council member who was pushing really hard to sort of, introduce the idea of managed retreat. I think in their particular case, they realized it was going to be exorbitantly expensive. It was going to be very difficult for them to do politically. And so they sort of backed off and decided to focus more on their housing. And there was a lot of pressure to get the housing rebuilt as quickly as possible. So, Joe, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Well, yeah, building on what Micah said, I think, you know, the individual examples are very important to learn lessons about what works and what doesn't. But if you step way up, you know, where GAO operates, looking across federal programs, I think there's a growing recognition at the federal level that it's really dumb to wait around for a disaster to happen and pay a bunch of more extra money afterwards to repair things. It's more cost effective to invest in resilience, and the federal government is creating various pots of money to do that. So it's incumbent upon GAO and others that sit where we do to understand and think about how do we spend that money well and focus it on the riskiest areas all across the United States. How do you go about prioritizing those pots of money, not just in areas where you might have sea level rise, but also in areas where you may have wildfires, et cetera. So we have a series of reports looking at how do you go about prioritizing those big pots of money. We're probably going to have more of them. And managed retreat or climate migration, as we call it in our report, is one type of project that would fit within an overall breadth of different types of projects, which I think Katie brought up. You know, you're gonna armor some places, you're gonna stay in some places, you're gonna partially retreat from some places, and some places you're gonna have to move because you won't have a place for people to live. And, you know, designing institutions to actually make that happen is where GAO is focused. So we've recommended designing an institution to prioritize those federal funds all across the country and actually creating a pilot program to figure out how do you actually do climate migration. If you've identified a place where you know people aren't going to be able to live, how do you actually go about helping them move out of that area? So at a very high level, that's where we're at. It's important to note that you're going to need this is all hands on deck. You're going to need everybody working at the local level, and you're going to need people working at the federal level, and you're going to have to meet in the middle because this is a big problem that not one agency or entity can handle.
Yes, I think that's certainly true. We're getting a sense of that, and a few economic pieces I want to touch on in a minute, a few questions around that. But first, we have a few questions that I think are important for people to think about, and Lauren and Lida would love to start with you, and then Katie and Micah and Joe. So a few people are asking about sort of distance, you know, so someone's getting a buyout and moving, you know, Lauren, you mentioned that New York had some land that was available that was sort of lucky in this case that wasn't too far away to be able to build a new, more resilient structure and home. But, you know, is there consideration, how far away should we be looking? You know, should we be looking in the same communities knowing, you know, the city might continue to rise, or how far away were you typically looking when you were looking at options for relocation?
You know, that's a really interesting question. I mentioned, you know, here in New York City, we're always thinking about how concepts travel and translate across different scales, right? And I think the important distinction there between a buyout program and these sort of this idea of, you know, relocation or sending and receiving communities is that difference between an individual choice and an individual household by household or house by house service, like a buyout program, compared to a longer term adaptation timescale that might create more space to use more traditional tools to shape development, like land use, zoning, and so on and so forth. And so specifically for the Edgemere case, we were looking really within that neighborhood because of the unique nature of the neighborhood, its history, the fact that the city owned land and not only owned it, but that it was codified in an urban renewal area. And that HPD, as the urban renewal agency, had a mandate to ensure, sort of from a holistic view, the wellness of that neighborhood. And so all of this context informed our decision for the Edgemere Rebuild Relocation Pilot to relocate within the neighborhood. The larger program, actually, that we shifted to after this pilot was more of a cash resettlement assistance incentive, which offered more flexibility to the homeowners to relocate wherever they chose. And at the end of the day, when you're implementing on this house by house scale, that flexibility is so important.
Definitely. Lida, anything to add? You might be on mute.
Every time. Just to add in a bit, I think with New York, because we're such a dense environment and not every neighborhood really has perhaps city or publicly controlled land in the way that Edgemere does, the way that we've begun to start to look at implementing some of these, I would call them sort of density shifting mechanisms and approaches really are through some of those traditional land use tools like zoning and other measures and forms of development where we can shift development a bit more to perhaps less vulnerable locations and in structures and infrastructure that can accommodate additional protections within the site and the structure itself. So being such a dense environment, we're not necessarily always have the sort of opportunity of open or undeveloped sites to be able to create sort of a one-for-one. So we're not really actively looking at relocation in that sense, but using other tools creates opportunity.
Makes sense, and I love some of the images that show, how you're using the land that's freed up for green infrastructure and other, adaptation part of your larger strategy. Katie, kind of a related question, the idea of a receiving community, and I know that that's something that you offer tools for in your toolkit as well, that the communities that will be receiving people who are leaving climate vulnerable areas need to be ready and need to be aware of sort of their needs. Can you just really briefly talk a little bit about your work on receiving communities?
Sure. So fundamentally, sort of in the same way of trying to define what managed retreat is, a receiving community, I think, has a really broad definition. So it's basically where somebody may relocate from another vulnerable area. So in our context, we're looking at vulnerable coastal areas, but that could be within the same neighborhood or municipality, as you see with New York City. It could be a regional move, so you're maybe within the same county, could be within the same state, or it could be to another state or country, as we saw with the large influx of migrations out of Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. So there are going to be ways that it's going to be easier to plan to quote unquote become a receiving community if you're anticipating trying to discourage or regulatorily prohibiting development or conducting buyouts within a municipality. Maybe if you have higher ground areas that you can invest in. I think it becomes more difficult where data is needed to really make those proactive planning and sort of structural investments in receiving communities, where I know in Louisiana, they're one of the state forefront leaders in terms of thinking about this, given the rate of coastal land loss and flooding they're facing. But bottom line, I think is going to be the biggest sort of threshold question that communities will have to face is how do we figure out, even if we are receiving community, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. It could be difficult, for example, to factor personal preferences, like if I'm going to move, maybe I'm going to move where my family is, and how do you factor that into a statistical model? So really starting with the data and trying to see what you can figure out locally, and if there's sort of a broader state by state or region by region scale, how can you sort of figure out that? And then from there, trying to factor, for example, population projections into local land use and planning tools. Are there opportunities for state on a regional or state by state basis to provide technical support and funding assistance, and just thinking about this more comprehensively, again, not just getting people out of harm's way, but where are they going and what will they need when they get there?
Makes a lot of sense. I know time has gone so quickly. I do want to get to one last question. We've had a lot of questions about the money, right? So this is important because it is a big fiscal undertaking, and we know climate change and climate adaptation is woefully underfunded at every level. So maybe Mike and Joe start with you, and then we'll love to hear from the other three of you if we have a few minutes. Where should we start to think about funding for this sort of effort, whether it's on the coast or also inland? What's the federal role? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about what New York has done in terms of the funding at the local level, and Katie would love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, this is Joe. I mean, at the federal level, you have any number of programs that operate as grant programs at the federal level, some of them new, some of them existing. The trick there is that most of these programs are grant programs, so it really relates to the capacity of a community to have a good grant writer and access those funds. So you're talking about like different FEMA pots of money, you're talking about some HUD grants, and so forth. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that we list in our reports, you know, that sort of at least give an understanding of what federal funds are available. But the facts are that these funds exist primarily for other purposes. So agencies are authorized to do specific things. In some cases, the idea of managed retreat or adaptation fits within the role of the agency, and you can sort of divert some of those funds over to do adaptation projects if you can write a good grant, or if you have some very strong personalities who think this is a priority. The things that we point out in our report over time is that adaptation hasn't been a priority, and that agencies basically exist to do other functions. So it's very hard to devote funds to these types of things. We recommend changing that in any number of ways. One of the ways that you can actually change it in the migration realm is to actually make it somebody's job to coordinate climate migration and deal with some of these federal, state, local interaction issues. And that's why we recommended a pilot program. So there are funds available. They're very hard to get right now. We don't think that's a good state of affairs. We recommend changes, and we talk to Congress every time that we can to sort of change that. But the facts are the facts, and that's the way it is. I don't know if somebody has some sort of different ideas at the state and local level.
Yeah, Katie would love briefly if you can talk a little bit about where to find funding help, and then Lida and Lauren would love if you have any comments on that before we wrap up.
Sure. So the short is in the cross-cutting policy sections of the toolkit, we have a section on funding that looks at pre and post-disaster federal, state, and local sources that could potentially be applied to retreat. Building on what Joe was mentioning, at the federal level, funding is primarily available in a post-disaster recovery context for buyouts, or there's other funding from agencies like NOAA and the U.S. Department of Agriculture for funding like the restoration of land. But sort of there's gaps in funding, I think, particularly for planning, community engagement processes, and also making a lot of these investments in receiving communities. So unless, you know, some type of federal pilot program comes along, I think those are especially where state and local governments can help try to fill the gap. So in the toolkit, we highlight examples of state programs that have funding available more broadly for climate adaptation, but it could be used to help support managed retreat purposes, and also local sustainable sources of funding like bonds or stormwater impact fees, which are often used with local programs to fund buyouts. So looking for those long-term sustainable sources, so that way retreat can occur ideally where it is, you know, wanted in a phased process that's supported by those sustainable funding sources.
Makes sense. And Lida and Lauren, anything to add from your perspective on how you use state and local funding?
Sure. So I'll just say that, look, a holistic vision, a shared vision really inspires leadership at all scales of government. And it's Lida's job day to day to try to weave a cohesive implementation strategy together from many different types of funding sources. So I'm going to pass it to you, Lida, to take this one.
Sure. I think just given the limited amount of time, I'll just kind of to step off of what Lauren mentioned. Really, it is kind of a weaving together a quilt of different funding sources. And I think something I want to sort of part this conversation with is that when we say managed retreat, we're often there's this sort of assumption or implicit notion that that space or land is we're retreating from it because it no longer has value or use. But if we can start to, you know, in addition to some of the larger sustainable funding sources that Katie and others shared, if we can kind of reframe around what that end use or alternate use might be that still has value, be it economically or community benefits, then you start to see all of these different partnerships, be it with local organizations or other agencies that can tap into different funding sources. And so a lot of this is partnership building, again, building off of that vision and really maintaining and regenerating value in these spaces.
You're muted.
I was unmuted. Happens to all of us. I wish we had more time. I know we went a few minutes over here, but I think we could speak for a few more hours if we had time. So maybe we'll think about another time to talk about this topic. I know there's lots of questions we didn't get to, but I just want to thank the 5 of you for everything you shared. This is such important work. It's something that we need to be thinking about across the country, especially knowing the racial equity issues that you know, are true in every community when it comes to climate change. I do want to mention that we have our virtual virtual symposium coming up next week on September 17th. We would love if you join the Salazar Center and all our partners. We will be talking about urban resilience all day long, and would love to have you join part of the conversation. Thank you so much for joining. Micah, Lida, Katie, Joe, Lauren, thank you so much. Have a great day and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.